How small is, to this day, a subject that is debated in science. The World Health Organization has done studies and suggests that that number could be as low as 0.1 grams per kilogram of body weight. Now, admittedly, the World Health Organization does their studies basically on what I think is almost criminal type mindset, which is how much is the least amount of food that we can give starving people to keep them from dying, which I don't think that's a good mindset, but it does have a certain amount of intellectual and probably real world validity. So fair play. It looks like in sports, that number is probably a little more like 0.3 to 0.5 grams per kilogram of body weight, which again is still shockingly low. If you're a 100-kilo bodybuilder, that literally means 50 grams of fat is more than sufficient on a daily basis to meet your requisites for life and performance, which is a very, very small number. Now, again, just to clear air of confusion, because people love to rummage through the crumbs in the seat cushions to find something to argue about. I wrote a book on sports nutrition. It's called Post-it Note Sports Nutrition, and it's called that because I rather facetiously wrote it on fucking sticky notes, for a number of reasons, mainly because it's just that simple. It really is. And in that book, I suggest a range between 1 and 0.5 grams per kilogram daily of total fat intake. Why all the way up at 1? The reason is, again, as I spoke about the pedantics of the language, there's a difference between an essential amount and a non-problematic amount. The essential amount seems to be, like I said, somewhere in that 0.3 range. I'm not even taking you that low. I'm taking you to 0.5, which allows a margin of surplus. But then in the same breath, from a practical eating point of view, if you're going to follow other recommendations, which I'll come to in a moment, of eating flesh and oily fishes and these sorts of things, it's very easy to modulate that value between 1 gram and 0.5. And it seems that at 1 gram per kilogram, as much as, say, 100 grams of fat daily for that 100-kilo athlete. Not that that's a goal, but that's an upper sensible value. That seems to work. And that is something that I also am, I'll say guilty of, is that I, rather than a lot of experts, and I'm not exactly criticizing them for that, but I am. I really am. Fuck them. I very overtly differentiate between the perfect answer and the abidable answer. There are some answers that this is exactly the correct answer, but the reality is no one can do it. So let's ignore that, and let's address what is the sensible range that we can, in fact, do on a daily basis. That is why I will allow an athlete up to, say, 1 gram per kilogram, is because to get all the other things done they want and not live on a ridiculous narrow band of foods that's very impractical, the practical answer deviates slightly from the perfect answer for that reason.
Even 1 gram is actually not high. That's not a lot. Yeah. That's actually quite hard to keep at that level, to keep it that low.
Well, it's funny you say that. Here's the thing, again, and I'm not trying to, champion my thing. But I'm more intimately knowledgeable about my thing than other people's things. That's fair. If you were to apply the concepts in my Post-it Note Nutrition, and I make recommendations for how to distribute protein selections, beef and fish versus dairy versus legumes, and I make recommendations on food selections. If you follow all of those things, beginning from the top down with total energy intake or calories, and then distribution of what is protein, what is fat, and you follow the food selections, interestingly, about 0.75, 0.85 is the number that falls out of that. And that is one of the reasons why I think it's correct. A correct answer should be coherent on every level. It shouldn't require you to do anything weird or convoluted or goofy. It should simply be the very first decision starts you down a path of correctness. That is why I am very comfortable putting my name on such a thing, is because I think if you just follow the first couple steps, it almost demands that all the next steps be very close to accurate.
And before we move into the protein, just one more question about carbs, actually two more. The very first one, more and more people start talking about insulin resistant, being insulin resistant. What does that actually mean? What's the correlation between carbs and insulin resistant, being an insulin resistant?
Well, once again, here's the thing. I'll answer your question, but before I answer that question, I want to say this. The reality is, even in a scientific laboratory, measuring something such as insulin resistance is very difficult. It's more of a symptom than a thing that can be directly measured. There's no gauge on your ass that you can look at and go, oh, fuck, you're insulin resistant. Holy shit. You know, fill up the tank. Like, there's no such thing. It's more of a behavioral response. And that response is, it requires more and more insulin to mediate that transmission of carbohydrates from bloodstream to muscle. Meaning that when I said as you exercise and get lean, muscles kind of prioritize themselves above other tissues to receive the carbohydrates. What insulin resistance means is that begins to then correct or normalize. Because, again, being a bodybuilder, and this is very important, being a bodybuilder, or even, for that matter, any version of hypermuscular athlete, is not normal. That's important to remember at all times. That is not a normal condition. So the moment you begin to put on super physiological amounts of muscle mass, your body is resisting you. You are doing something that it doesn't really want. So insulin resistance simply means that more and more insulin is required to accomplish the goal in which you're trying to achieve. Now, the consequence of that is you have an abundance of insulin, and then there is a lot to say, work on these other tissues that you don't want to be saturated, like adipose, etc. The reality is most bodybuilders are lean enough and muscular enough that well and true insulin resistance is just not a concern for them. Is it true that they might get, as I said, ever-growing values of plasma insulin? The answer is yes. But again, that's not a problem. The only time it becomes a problem is if the manifestation is they're accumulating adipose. If they're getting fatter on the same or lesser calories, that begins to become a concern. But again, not really because of insulin resistance. It's because it's contrary to their goals.
It almost sounds to me like being an insulin resistant simply means that your muscle mass and your activity level does not match to your carbs intake, rather than you eating too many carbs.
Coincidentally, that's exactly what it fucking means. It literally means that exactly. And on a more comedic note, you hear a lot of this yammering about insulin resistance in relation to growth hormone. And I know we're not talking about drugs, but once again, it's kind of almost the stupidity of the people talking is so apparent in that growth hormone raises plasma blood sugar levels. It does that. That's actually part of its fundamental job. It does that. So complaining that you take growth hormone and then you get high blood sugar is kind of like complaining about taking anabolic steroids and getting more muscular. It's about that fucking stupid. It's fucking posed to do that. But anyway.
So before we move to the proteins, just one more question about carbs in general. Sure. So if carbs are so beneficial to us and so anti-catabolic or so we can say anabolic, why people still believe that the best way to lose fat, and I'm specifically talking about fat loss right now, why people believe that low carb is to go?
Well, again, here's the thing. That really depends on your language, because to a degree, I don't like the word high or low carb. First of all, I almost never use that language unless I'm making fun of someone. However, no, it's true. And I'm completely comfortable saying that out loud. However, in the same breath, a calorie restriction demands that carbohydrates reduce over time. And my argument would be something like this. Again, let's turn the consideration to, say, an automobile. You have an automobile, and you regularly drive X number of miles or kilometers per week, and you require X amount of fuel. You have to buy 100 liters of fuel every week to perform the amount of activity that you do. Okay. If you start to, you also have in the background that doesn't make the conversation. You have a certain amount of other things, fuel filters and other parts that an automobile needs on a regular basis. Those would be analogous to the protein and the fats. Something that you need very unregularly might be like, say, tires. Okay, we'll make that consider that's the fat. Every 50,000 kilometers you need new tires. That's the amount of fat you need in a period of time. And then the other little bibs and bobs, the lights and the just stuff, that's the protein. Okay. Those rarely change because that's how often they need to be replaced. You only change your oil X number of miles or kilometers or whatever. So those numbers, they do change, but not significantly. The major thing that changes is your fuel requirement. So simply to diet, one consumes less fuel. The car will literally not go as far, and you meet your goals of getting smaller. The only way to get the car to go the same distance is to reduce its weight, its mass. That's physics. That's fundamental physics. That's a very childlike and simple example. So in a general sense, I would say even a high-carb guy like myself will definitely reduce carbohydrates as calorie restriction implies, because it's the fucking calories.
Yeah.
I don't know how else to word that. If you fix fat and protein, the only unfixed variable is the carbohydrates. So instead of going from moderate to very low, I'm going from pretty high to pretty moderate, but it's still a restriction. So again, carbohydrate restriction does precipitate fat loss. I'm guilty. Now, why might some people choose a higher protein, lower carbohydrate arrangement? A number of reasons, ranging from they don't understand fundamental science and biology. That's a completely valid approach. The other, and again, when I differentiated between, say, the perfect answer and the workable answer, things like personal preference, accessibility, culture, religion. There's a lot of reasons why people might be pushed toward a certain direction. However, it doesn't change the fundamental biology that additional protein really serves no additional benefit. That doesn't make it bad, but that in the same breath doesn't make it more good. Just because something's good doesn't mean twice that amount is in any way better. So that's fundamentally the size of it. Is your body is so, I shudder to use the word designed because that implies a religious connotation, but your body is so well adapted or designed to survive, and that is the fucking key word, that you can feed it almost anything and it will survive. However, that's a huge difference from the ideal arrangement. And by the way, I personally even do mention in my nutrition book that as you get, say, less medicated or start dieting harder, I do have a range of protein from, say, 2 grams per kilogram to 3 grams per kilogram as the target range. I do say as calorie restriction engages, you do migrate from the 2 toward the 3. And as a calorie surplus ensues, you migrate from the 3 to the 2. And that has to do with efficiency. And that efficiency is largely, wait for it, insulin. As calories go up, insulin goes up, which makes the anti-catabolic effects, which are largely associated with protein, makes the anti-catabolic effects such that you can consume less protein and get the same level of efficiency. And as you get a lower calorie intake, you get a lower insulin value, and then you get less efficient with protein. So once again, this evil demonized insulin is literally the mover on pretty much every positive aspect that we can talk about.
So in a bro science language, people say carbs are protein sparing. So that's accurate.
100% accurate. 100% accurate.
Right.
But what they don't understand is the why. If they understood the why, they would feel much better about exploiting carbohydrates.